The pen felt heavier than it should have. Audra Sinclair had held it for almost 3 minutes, staring at the line where her signature was supposed to go, and the lawyer across the table, her husband's lawyer, not hers, had already cleared his throat twice. The document was 42 pages long. She had read every single one of them the night before, alone at the kitchen table, with a cup of tea that went cold, in the house that still smelled like the cedar candles she'd bought at the farmer's market in Kensington 2 Christmases ago. She signed. She didn't cry until she was in the elevator. It wasn't the kind of crying that came with sound. It was the other kind. The kind that happens when your body gives up trying to hold something in and just lets it go quietly, without asking permission. The elevator doors opened onto the lobby of the building on Bay Street, and Audra walked out into the February cold, with her coat half-buttoned and her eyes burning, and nobody on the street looked twice. That was the thing about Toronto. You could fall apart in public, and it just looked like the weather. She and Rexton had been married for 6 years. She'd met him when she was 29 and he was 35, at a fundraiser for the Sick Kids Foundation that her firm had sponsored. He was charming in the way that certain men are charming, effortlessly, like breathing. He knew the names of the waitstaff and remembered what everyone was drinking, and had a laugh that made the people around him feel like they'd said something clever. She'd been flattered. She'd been a little bit dazzled. She'd told herself that was the same as love. Maybe for a while it was. Rexton Holt ran his family's property development company. His father had built it. Rexton had expanded it. He was good at acquisition, buying things, improving them, making them more valuable, selling them on. Audra had not understood until much later that this was also how he approached people. The problems had started 3 years in, though she could trace certain hairline fractures back further if she was honest with herself. The late nights that weren't always explained. The business trips where his phone went to voicemail for hours at a time. The way he could be warm and present one evening, and then cold and distracted the next, like a radio signal that drifted in and out depending on the weather. She'd tried to talk to him about it. Twice she'd suggested counseling. Both times he'd agreed in a way that meant he'd already decided not to go. Then, in November, a woman named Celeste Dawn Brown had called the house line. She hadn't meant to. She'd been trying to reach Rexton's mobile and she'd misdialed, but the call connected, and Audra had answered, and Celeste had said, "Is Rex there?" And there was something in the voice, a specific kind of casual familiarity, that told Audra everything she needed to know before she even said a word back. She didn't say anything back. She set the phone down on the counter very carefully, like it was something breakable. That night, she'd asked Rexton directly. He hadn't denied it. He'd sat down at the kitchen island and said, in the tone of someone presenting a business case, that he thought they'd grown apart. That these things happened. That he was sorry, but he thought it was better to be honest. She'd stood by the window and listened to him be honest with her, and she'd thought, 6 years. I gave you 6 years. The divorce had taken 4 months. Rexton had a team of lawyers. Audra had one. A friend of a friend, a good woman named Patricia Osei Bonsu, who worked out of an office in Scarborough and who had done her best, but who was honest enough to tell Audra early on that Rexton's team had structured the prenuptial agreement in a way that limited her options considerably. She'd signed it when she was 29 and in love, and not yet aware that love could also be a distraction. She walked out of that marriage with her car, her personal savings, and half the value of the condo they'd bought together on Queen West, which sounded like something until you factored in the legal fees and the cost of the apartment she'd had to rent in a hurry when Rexton asked her to move out so he could list the place. The apartment was on Dufferin, near Bloor. 3rd floor, 1 bedroom, a kitchen with a window that looked out at the back of another building. It was fine. It was clean. It was the kind of place that reminded you, every time you came home, that your life had recently become much smaller. She didn't tell many people how bad it actually was. Her mother knew in the way that mothers know things without being told. Her best friend, a woman named Joss Mackinnon, who lived in Calgary and who called every Sunday, knew. Everyone else got the version where Audra was fine, doing well, taking time for herself. She was 35 years old and starting over from a floor she hadn't expected to land on, and she was very, very tired. She found out she was pregnant in March. She had been sitting on the edge of the bathtub in the apartment on Dufferin, holding the test and staring at it, and her first thought, her very first, before fear or shock or any practical consideration, was a strange, small flash of something that might have been wonder. A life. There was a life. Her second thought was, Rexton is going to be furious. He was. When she called to tell him, because she felt she had to, even though every instinct told her not to, he went quiet in a way that was different from his usual silence. Then he said, carefully, that perhaps they should discuss this. That perhaps there were options she should consider. She knew what options meant. She said, I'm keeping the baby, and she hung up. 3 days later, a courier arrived at the apartment with a letter from Rexton's legal team. It was politely worded but unmistakable in its intent. They wished to remind her that the divorce agreement did not include provisions for child support in the event of a pregnancy post-separation, and that any claims she intended to make should be directed through proper legal channels. She sat at the kitchen table and read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in the folder where she kept important documents, and she called Patricia, who sighed and said, We're going to fight this. The pregnancy was harder than she'd expected. Not medically. Her doctor said everything was progressing well, that she was healthy, that the baby was healthy. But the ordinary daily weight of it, doing this alone in a small apartment on a reduced income, while her body changed in ways she hadn't prepared for, pressed down on her in ways she hadn't anticipated. She was still working. She was a project manager at an urban planning consultancy, a job she was good at and that she found genuinely meaningful. But the firm had been going through restructuring since the fall, and 3 months after her divorce she'd been reduced to contract work. Still busy, but without benefits, without the predictability she needed. In April, she took a second bus home from a late meeting. The subway had been disrupted, and the alternative route added 40 minutes to her commute, and she was standing at the stop on Dundas, 6 months pregnant, with a bag full of files over one shoulder, when the woman standing next to her looked over and said, quietly, Do you want to sit down? I've got room on the bench. The woman was perhaps 60, wearing a wool coat with a tartan lining, and she had the kind of face that looked like it had always been kind. Audra sat down. The woman's name was Harriet Colson. No, wait. That name was already in the file. The woman's name was June Ostrowski. She was a retired school principal from Etobicoke. She'd been visiting her daughter in Parkdale and missed her bus and was waiting for the next one. She and Audra sat together for 20 minutes, while the sleet came down sideways, and talked about almost nothing. The construction on Queen, the early spring, whether the snow was finally done for the year, and when June's bus came, she pressed a small packet of maple candies into Audra's hand and said, You're doing fine. Even when it doesn't feel like it. It was the most comforting thing anyone had said to Audra in months. She thought about that a lot afterward. The specific kindness of strangers. How sometimes the people who see you most clearly are the ones with nothing at stake. She met Theo Bannister in May, at the Eaton Center of all places. She had gone to exchange a sweater, and she'd gotten turned around near the food court and walked into him. Literally, her shoulder bag swinging into his forearm, and she'd said, I'm so sorry, and he'd said, Don't be, I wasn't paying attention either. He was tall, brown-haired, with the kind of face that took a moment to notice and then was hard to stop noticing. He was carrying a grocery bag with a pineapple in it, which struck her as an oddly domestic detail for a stranger. He looked at her with immediate and genuine concern. She was visibly pregnant by then, 7 months, and she'd nearly knocked him sideways, and said, Are you all right? I'm fine, she said, which was what she always said. You look like you've been carrying that bag on the wrong shoulder for about 6 hours. She laughed. She couldn't help it. It was such a specific and accurate observation. His name was Theo Bannister. He was an emergency physician at St. Michael's. He was 38. He was calm in the way that emergency doctors tend to be calm. Not because they don't feel things, but because they've trained themselves to feel things without letting the feeling get in the way. He switched her bag to her other shoulder without asking and said, Better? She'd said, Don't you need to go somewhere? He said, I'm off until Tuesday. They had coffee in the food court. It was not romantic. It was 2 people talking in plastic chairs, with a background score of mall noise and a view of the Sephora kiosk. But he listened to her, really listened. with the kind of attention that isn't waiting for its turn to speak. And when she told him, more than she'd meant to, about the pregnancy and the divorce and the contract work and the apartment on Dufferin, he didn't offer solutions or suggestions. He just said, "That's a lot to be carrying." She told him about the bus stop and June Ostrowski and the maple candies. He said he'd like to be a better kind of help than maple candies if she'd let him. She was cautious. She'd learned caution. She told him she wasn't looking for anything complicated right now, that her life was already complicated, that she appreciated the coffee but didn't want to give anyone the wrong impression. He nodded and said, "That's fair. Can I give you my number in case you need someone who knows how to read a prenatal chart and also makes reasonable pasta?" She took the number. She didn't call for 2 weeks. When she finally did, it was because the radiator in the Dufferin apartment had started making a sound like a trapped animal, and the landlord wasn't returning her calls. And it was a Thursday night, and she was sitting on the couch, trying to eat crackers and feeling very sorry for herself. And she thought, June Ostrowski would tell me I was doing fine. Maybe I should call someone who will tell me the truth instead. Theo came over with a toolkit he'd borrowed from a neighbor and diagnosed the radiator in about 8 minutes and told her exactly what to tell the landlord. He stayed for 2 hours. He made tea. He found the kettle himself, which required locating it behind the box of files she'd been using as a temporary shelf. And they talked until past 11, and when he left he said, "Call me, for anything." She did. She'd told herself it wasn't going to be important, that she had too much happening to let someone become important. But the thing about Theo was that he showed up, not dramatically, not with speeches or grand gestures. He just appeared consistently at the edges of her life, driving her to an appointment when her car was in the shop, dropping off a container of soup when she mentioned she'd been too tired to cook, texting to check in the morning after a hard meeting she'd mentioned in passing. He remembered things. The name of her doctor, the date of the custody-related hearing she was dreading, the fact that she preferred Earl Grey over English breakfast. It was the remembering that undid her in the end. She could have resisted almost anything else. Her son was born in late June at St. Michael's, which felt like a coincidence that the universe was making obvious. She'd called her mother, who drove down from Kingston and arrived in time to be there. She'd called Joss, who cried on the phone from Calgary. Theo was working that night, but he came as soon as his shift ended. Still in his scrubs, and he stood at the window of the maternity ward and looked at the baby for a long time without saying anything. Then he said, "He's got your exact expression." She said, "What expression?" He said, "The one that means you're taking everything in before you decide what to think about it." She named the baby Elliot. No, that name was in the file. She named him Crispin James Sinclair, her surname, not Holt. Rexton had not come to the hospital. He had sent a message through his assistant that he was out of the country on business. The message had arrived the same day the first legal notification did. Rexton's team was filing for paternity recognition, not because he wanted to be a father, Patricia explained carefully, but because paternity recognition was a prerequisite for certain legal maneuvers involving custody scheduling and financial claims. It was strategic. It had nothing to do with the child. He wants to be recognized as the father legally, Patricia said, so that he can later argue against paying meaningful support on the grounds that his involvement was always minimal. Audra stared at her across the desk. He wants credit for being the father so he can dodge being a father, more or less. She had thought she was done being surprised by Rexton Holt. She was wrong. The months after Crispin was born were the hardest of her life, and also, somehow, the most clarifying. There is something about difficulty, real difficulty, the kind that doesn't resolve quickly and doesn't ask your permission, that burns away everything that isn't essential. She learned what she actually needed. She learned who she could count on. She learned that she was more capable than she had understood herself to be, and she was not sure that she'd learned that last thing any other way. She went back to work when Crispin was 12 weeks old. Her mother came to stay for the first month. After that, she found a home daycare 2 blocks away run by a woman named Beulah Marchetti Owens, who had been doing this for 18 years and who looked at Crispin on the first day and said, "He's going to be a talker, I can already tell." She was right. Theo was there. Not in a way that was ever obligatory or pressured. He never once made her feel like she owed him anything for his presence. He was just there the way reliable things are there. The same way a streetcar runs on time or a building stays standing. She would not have said she was in love with him for a long time. She would have said she trusted him, which she knew by then was rarer and harder and worth more. Rexton, by contrast, was a recurring legal problem. He had indeed filed for paternity recognition, and then, once that was established, had filed for a formal custody arrangement, not because he wanted custody, but because, as Patricia had predicted, the filing gave his legal team room to negotiate on the support amounts. He'd seen Crispin exactly twice in the first year of his son's life. Once at a court-ordered appearance, and once at a family event where Audra had been present, and where Rexton had held the baby, with the expression of someone holding something they weren't entirely sure how to return. Crispin was 14 months old when the story broke. It started on a business blog, the kind that covers Bay Street gossip alongside actual news, with a piece about irregularities in 2 Holt development projects. The details were dry, the language careful, but the implication was clear. Contracts that had been awarded to companies in which Rexton held undisclosed interests. A city councilor's name appearing in communications where it shouldn't. Project timelines that didn't align with permits. Audra read the article on her phone during her lunch break, sitting at her desk with Crispin's picture on her screensaver, and felt something cold settle into her chest. She had known about some of those projects. She had, in fact, managed the planning coordination on one of them, a mixed-use development in the Portlands, in the last year of their marriage. At the time, she hadn't thought twice about certain structural decisions that Rexton had explained away as standard practice. She understood now, reading the article, what she had been positioned not to see. Her phone rang that afternoon. It was a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer. The woman on the other end said her name was Diane Forsyth O'Barrow, and that she was a journalist with a national publication, and that she had been investigating the Holt development story for 7 months, and that Audra's name had come up as someone who might have relevant information. She said she wanted Audra to know before the story was fully published, because she thought it was fair. Audra sat very still. She said, "What kind of relevant information?" Diane said carefully, "The kind that would help establish a timeline. You were involved in the Portlands project at a specific point. The documentation we have suggests decisions were made in that window that are now significant. We're not alleging anything about you. We want to make sure you're not caught off guard." She hung up and called Patricia immediately. Patricia said, "This is actually useful for us." Audra said, "How is this useful for us?" Patricia said, "Because if his projects are under investigation, his financial disclosures in your divorce proceedings become very interesting." She had not thought of that. She should have. What followed was 8 months, that she would later struggle to describe to people who hadn't lived through anything similar. There were depositions. There were additional legal filings. Patricia brought in a colleague, a forensic accountant named Kwame Asante-Briggs, who spent 6 weeks going through the financial records from the divorce and emerged with a document that was 48 pages long and very specific about where certain assets had been misstated. Rexton's lawyers fought hard. They were very good at their jobs and they were very expensive. And there were moments, more than a few, where Audra lay awake at 3 in the morning and thought about how much easier it would be to just let it go. To accept the original settlement, to build her quiet life on Dufferin with Crispin and Theo and stop pulling at a thread that kept leading somewhere darker. But she thought about Diane Forsyth O'Barrow, who had called to warn her out of fairness. She thought about Patricia, who had been working on contingency for months. She thought about what it would mean for Crispin, in practical terms, if his father's hidden assets weren't accounted for. She kept pulling. The settlement that came out of the revised proceedings was not what Audra had originally received. It was considerably different. Kwame's documentation had been thorough. The investigation into Holt development had produced evidence that overlapped with the financial disclosures in a way that Rexton's team could not fully navigate around. There was a revised support arrangement that reflected Crispin's actual needs rather than what Rexton had originally offered. She did not gloat about any of this. She was not a person who gloated. But she sat in Patricia's office when it was done, and she felt something release in her chest that had been wound tight for 2 years and she allowed herself to cry. The real kind, the kind with sound. And Patricia handed her a tissue and said, "You did that. I want you to know that. You stayed in it." She moved out of the Dufferin apartment when Crispin was 20 months old. She found a semi-detached in Roncesvalles, 3 bedrooms, a yard with a maple tree, a kitchen with actual counter space. It cost more than the apartment, but less than it would have 2 years earlier, and she could afford it now. She stood in the backyard on the first evening and watched Crispin try to walk on the grass. He was still new to the uneven terrain, listing slightly to the right, and thought, this is what it's supposed to feel like. Theo was there. He'd helped her move boxes in the morning, and now he was sitting on the back steps, drinking the coffee she'd made in the new kitchen, watching Crispin navigate the yard, with the expression he'd worn in the hospital window. The one that meant something was working its way through him. She sat down next to him on the steps, he said. "He's going to fall," she said. "He'll get up." They watched Crispin sit down hard on the grass and look around with an expression of affront, and then start pulling up a handful of grass with great purpose, as if the falling had been part of the plan.
Theo's.
"You know, I've been trying to figure out when to say this for about 8 months.
She said, "Say what?"
He said, "That I love you," which I know is a statement that requires a lot of context, given everything, and I'm not trying to put any pressure on anything. But I thought you should know, because you're someone who should know things that are true." She looked at the maple tree. She looked at Crispin, who had given up on the grass and was now examining a pine cone with intense scientific focus. She looked at Theo, at the familiar angles of his face, at the way he was watching her with exactly the patience she had come to understand was native to him, not performed. She said, "I know." He said, "That I love you," she said. "That it's true." It was not a perfect story. It did not resolve cleanly at a single moment, or arrive at a destination that felt like an ending. Real things don't, in her experience. There was still the ongoing co-parenting arrangement with Rexton, which was civil and managed, and required her to be in a room with him periodically and to remember, deliberately, that civility was for Crispin's sake and not for Rexton's. There were still weeks that were too full, and nights that were too quiet, and the ordinary weight of building a life from scratch, at an age when you'd expected to already have one. But there were also Saturday mornings in the Roncesvalles kitchen, with Crispin eating toast on the floor, because he'd decided he preferred the floor to the high chair, and Theo making eggs and arguing with the CBC morning show under his breath. There were Sunday afternoons in High Park, when the leaves came in and Crispin ran between the trees with his arms out, like he was trying to catch the air. There were phone calls with Joss in Calgary where they laughed until they ran out of breath. There was the afternoon Kwame Asante Briggs sent her a copy of the final filing with a note that said simply, "Solid work, Miss Sinclair." There was the particular feeling of standing in her own backyard, in a house that was hers, in a life that was hers. Not the life she had planned at 29, not the one she'd thought she was building with Rexton's charm and the cedar candles and the condo on Queen West. A different one, harder one, better understood. The kind of life that knows what it cost and chooses to be grateful anyway. She thought sometimes about what she would tell herself. The 29-year-old version holding the pen of the fundraiser, dazzled by the laugh in the room. She would not tell her not to sign. She wasn't sure it worked like that, the way experience accumulates into wisdom. Maybe you have to live through the thing to understand what the thing was teaching you. But if she could say one thing, she thought she would say, pay attention to who shows up. Not who arrives, who shows up. There's a difference, and it takes a while to learn it, but it's the most important thing. Crispin was 2.5 now. He had 11 words, 4 of which were variations on the word no, and he had her exact expression. Theo had been right about that. The one that meant he was taking everything in before deciding what to think. He was going to be fine. She was going to be fine. They already were, in the ways that mattered, in the middle of the ordinary Wednesday morning life that was theirs. That was enough. It was, she'd learned, quite a lot.